How's it going, everybody? So with the release of Avengers Endgame upon us this weekend, it's the culmination of 22 films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Infinity Saga. So I feel like this is the perfect time to rank all the films from worst to best. The Marvel Cinematic Universe definitely is a very great shared universe, so it's definitely a fun video to make. But before I get into my ranking, let me know in the comment section down below how you'd rank the films from worst to best. Even if you haven't seen Endgame yet, I'd still like to know. Just get a discussion going in the comments. Obviously, if you're going to comment your list, let's be civil here, because there's going to be a lot of varying opinions, because not everybody's going to have the same favorite or the least favorite. It's just the way it is, especially with these Marvel rankings. But without further ado, let's jump right into my pick at number 22. At my number 22 pick, I have Thor: The Dark World. While I do really enjoy the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole, this film is probably one of the more generic and forgettable entries in the entire MCU. The story in this one, centered around Malekith's return, just never really grabbed me as anything interesting, even after the loads and loads of exposition we get. And honestly, Malekith is probably one of, if not the worst, MCU villain to date. Of course, there are other entries that I'll get to that have some pretty bad villains as well, but he's always stuck out to me as one of the really just forgettable, lackluster villains in the MCU. Malekith wasn't the only problem though. Thor and Jane Foster's relationship was probably at its peak worst, which I'm kind of glad they kind of just threw all that stuff out for Thor Ragnarok, but I'll get to Thor Ragnarok later on. But yeah, overall, definitely just a very bland entry in the MCU. At my number 21 pick, I have Iron Man 2. I feel like this film's major flaw is just that there's so much stuff going on in this, where for the most part, it really just felt like just a straight up setup to the Avengers. Of course, there are things to like. I do always love Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark, and I actually really like Sam Rockwell as Justin Hammer. I've always wanted him to come back to the MCU in some way, just because I've always loved Sam Rockwell and that character. But while I love Sam Rockwell, I just really could not get into Mickey Rourke as Whiplash and his whole cheesy one-liners and like, I want my bird and stuff like that. I just really never liked him as a character. Even in the action scenes, although he does have that cool action scene at the racetrack, but after that, there really isn't a lot of action. I don't know if a lot of people realize that there's really not a whole lot of action between that scene at the racetrack and then the very end final battle between him and War Machine and Iron Man. There's really, like, probably one of the least action-packed entries in the whole MCU, which is okay if you do it right, but there was nothing really in this film that captured my interest because there were so many plot threads going on. Coming in at number 20, I have Iron Man 3. Now, this is definitely one of the more divisive films in the MCU. A lot of people either love it or hate it. I don't hate it, I just have never been a big fan of it. I do like Shane Black for the most part as a director and writer, but I just really didn't like the twists and turns he did with this entry in the Iron Man franchise. I wasn't a big fan of the whole twist with the Mandarin, oh, he's Trevor, and I didn't really like the Extremist storyline with Guy Pearce. There are some bits I did enjoy, like I did like Iron Man and his interactions with the little boy, and some of the action's actually pretty good as well. It's just, all that stuff is just compounded with all, like, I just never really found myself being very interested in rewatching this film. I did rewatch it for the purposes of the ranking and watching it leading up to Avengers Endgame, but I've always just found this to be one of the weaker entries, just because I've never really liked anything to do with the story or its villains. It's never packed a punch to me. At my number 19 pick, I have The Incredible Hulk. Probably the least talked about MCU entry for many reasons, one of them being Edward Norton was the Incredible Hulk in this, and then he was recast with Mark Ruffalo in future installments. But I really liked him as the Incredible Hulk. This is one of the more underrated films. Sure, it doesn't have the best story, but I definitely think this has some of the most exciting Hulk action we've seen so far. Obviously, the main highlight is the final battle with the Abomination, and I kind of wish that we had seen where this could have gone with Edward Norton and interacting with the Avengers and all that, but I do really like Mark Ruffalo as well. It's definitely not the best story-wise, though. I will give it that, but it's just like a very solid gem that most people forget about in this whole MCU, just because you don't really need to see it to understand the rest of the MCU. It doesn't really follow the formula as much, which I think gives it some of its charm. At my number 18 pick, I have Thor. Now, this is another early entry in the MCU. We're kind of stumbled out the gate a little bit. I did really love the look and feel of Asgard. I think Kenneth Branagh did a phenomenal job bringing that to the screen. But I think once we left Asgard and Thor got banished to Earth and it became your typical fish out of water storyline, it kind of did suffer a little bit. That's not to say the entire fish out of water storyline wasn't done well. There actually was some really good comedic moments, especially with Thor as Chris Hemsworth is just a really great, funny actor. He was a really perfect casting choice, and so was Tom Hiddleston as Loki as well. They haven't reached their full potential in this film, but you knew that they were going to go on to become a really great duo in the MCU. But this is definitely not their best entry. It was an okay origin story, but they got better in Thor Ragnarok and a little bit in Thor: The Dark World, but not by much. Coming in at number 17, I have Captain Marvel, easily one of the most controversial MCU films. As an origin story, I feel like this just left a lot to be desired, because this is supposed to be our big introduction to Captain Marvel. before she appears in Avengers Endgame, and I really came out of this really feeling like I didn't really know her very much at all. I did, however, really like the dynamic between her and Nick Fury. It was really cool to see this buddy cop feel from them throughout the film. I also just really liked seeing more full fleshed out backstory for Nick Fury, because we really haven't gotten that so far. We got to see this more young, inexperienced, naive version of him, and then we come to see how he became that way. But I really just like that aspect. But other than that, I mean, I think that the Skrulls are really cool. Ben Mendelsohn did a really great job in introducing us to the Skrulls in the MCU. But the action and the story kind of just fell flat for me. Otherwise, I would have probably ranked this higher on the list. With my number 16 pick, I have Captain America, the First Avenger. Now, there's a lot to like about the First Avenger, especially the very compelling origin story of Steve Rogers, and sets up his won't go down without a fight attitude. But I feel like the film is really just bogged down by, I just really didn't like the Red Skull, played by Hugo Weaving. I just found him to be a very dull villain, but even with him not being one of my favorite MCU villains, this is one MCU entry I do pop in from time to time, and I kind of just scroll past his parts because they kind of make me doze off. Still a very solid origin film, although it's not one of my favorite origin films. Coming in at my number 15 pick, I have Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, after Infinity War pretty much crushed all of our spirits, this felt like a nice breath of fresh air with really low stakes, and I think that's why I liked it so much. Of course, it was also a great addition to the cast having Evangeline Lilly come and be the Wasp, because I think she bounced off of Paul Rudd's character really well, and she was also really badass in both films, but she actually gets to kick a lot of ass in this. Ghost was definitely one of the more forgettable, lackluster villains, but the film has really basic plot, but the low stakes make it just kind of a fun breath of fresh air, so I think that's part of why I've actually found myself enjoying this entry. With my number 14 pick, I have Ant-Man. Now, it is unfortunate that Edgar Wright didn't get to direct this like it was originally planned, but this film definitely has his fingerprints all over it. I did really enjoy that this is essentially just a heist film, but I think Paul Rudd and Michael Douglas do a really great job. You can definitely tell they had a lot of fun making this and have some really good chemistry. Of course, Michael Pena steals the show in this with his very quirky, fun dialogue and his way he tells stories. I also just have to praise the use of shrinking and getting bigger in the action scenes, because they make them really interesting and unique. And I like that about the Ant-Man character, is that you get that kind of cool kind of dynamic. Of course, Yellow Jacket isn't one of the best MCU villains. Corey Stoll kind of played him a little bit over the top, but if they had a better villain, I think this definitely could have been much higher on the list. But still a very fun entry in the MCU. Coming in at my number 13 pick, I have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. While I didn't enjoy this one as much as the first Guardians of the Galaxy, I still think it's a very solid sequel. It's got a good amount of laughs, but I really feel like the overall tone and story is kind of all over the place in this one. I did like Ego a little bit as a villain, but he really doesn't do too much for most of the runtime. Of course, Kurt Russell's a great actor, but they could have just done a little bit more with him as the villain, I think. The big bonus this film does have is the amount of character development we get for Yondu. I didn't really like him as much coming out of the first Guardians of the Galaxy, but with all the development and the backstory we get with him in this film, I actually ended up really liking him and was really sad with the outcome of his character. Of course, he also has some really good comedic moments, obviously, like, I'm Mary Poppins, y'all. But overall, it's an okay film. It's not in my top 10, just outside. At my number 12 pick, I have Avengers Age of Ultron. With this being the sequel to the big team-up movie, you can tell Joss Whedon wanted more of everything that made the first Avengers so great, between the humor, action set pieces, and raising the stakes for all the characters involved. And there's certainly enough there to keep you really excited throughout the runtime. It does kind of meander a little bit at times. I really love the additions of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, although Quicksilver didn't really last that long. But Ultron was kind of a disappointment, because he's really scary and menacing, but then they kind of made him overly funny at points in time, and I thought that was kind of a weird kind of spin on the character. Coming in at my number 11 pick, I have Black Panther. After we got a little bit of him in Captain America Civil War, this is his first solo outing, and it did not disappoint. Ryan Coogler did a phenomenal job bringing the character to life. Also, the world of Wakanda is so vast and beautiful. This film has some of the best production design probably in all of the MCU, actually, but it definitely has one of the more mature storylines, I think, just between T'Challa coming to terms with him becoming king and taking over his kingdom, and not only that, but Killmonger comes and has his own agenda. He's definitely one of the best villains. Michael B. Jordan did a great job with this villain character. He sways Wakanda, and for the most part, he probably swayed the audience in his favor as well by the end of the film, even though he's supposed to be the bad guy. Coming in at my number 10 pick, I have SpiderMan Homecoming. Now, I'm a really big Spider-Man fan, so I was really happy to see him come back and be in the MCU. Of course, Tom Holland is a really great Spider-Man, as well. I really like him, not just as Spider-Man, but as Peter Parker as well, because he's really charming, but he's also naive and at the same time, as most people in high school are. And it's actually a really believable high school environment in this, so I really like that about his MCU entries. But not only that, but it's really cool to see him be mentored by Tony Stark, which is kind of an odd choice, but I actually really liked it. It was really cool. Although he's not in it too much, he doesn't steal the show, but it really just is cool to have him as a mentor and kind of integrate him into the MCU. But not only that, but the Vulture. That really surprised me as well. Michael Keaton does a really great job as the Vulture. Not only that, but the costume's cool as well. Michael Keaton's just a great actor in general, but he brings something new and dynamic to these roles in the MCU because the villains aren't always the greatest, but he's probably one of the best MCU villains because he's not just doing all this evil stuff to be bad, but he's also doing it to help support his family. Also, he has some really great interactions with Spider-Man, not just as Spider-Man though, as Peter Parker as well. And it makes me really excited for Spider-Man Far From Home when it comes out in a couple months. Coming in at my number 9 pick, I have Doctor Strange. Now, this is our introduction to magic into the MCU, and because of that, we get some really crazy, wild, amazing, trippy visuals, which is one of the very cool aspects to Doctor Strange. I feel like his story is very underrated. It's definitely not one of the amazing origin stories, but had this film had a much better villain, because this is probably the second worst villain other than Malekith, because Matt Mikkelsen is just a very bland, generic, stock villain that really, I don't even remember his name. I think it was Caecilius? It was just like, who cares about this villain? It was just such a waste of a character. But had he had a better villain in his origin story, this would have been a much more liked film, I think. Because other than him, everyone else did a really great job, especially Benedict Cumberbatch, because I think that was phenomenal casting him as Doctor Strange. He does a really great job conveying the arrogance and sarcasm that's very similar to Tony Stark, but he also shows a lot of humanity in the process, so it's definitely one of the interesting entries in the MCU, and I really liked him, and I actually liked him even more in Infinity War. I think a lot of people grew to love him a lot more when he got more fleshed out in Infinity War. But this was a solid origin story for Doctor Strange. I feel it's one of the better films, but I know that I'm in the minority there. At my number 8 pick, I have Thor Ragnarok. Now, initially when this was announced, I really wasn't that excited because of how much I disliked Thor the Dark World, but I was genuinely surprised. Taika Waititi really impressed me, and he breathed new life into this franchise with its humor and this vibrant color palette he brought. It's definitely one of the most fun watches in the MCU. Of course, there's a lot of dramatic moments that were ruined by the humor. I mean, I was just having so much fun that I really wasn't worried about those moments, but I know that some people were taken aback and didn't like Thor Ragnarok because of how overly funny it was for no reason. But I still had a fun time. All the new characters were great as well, especially Valkyrie, Grandmaster, and Korg and Meek. I hope that those characters make more appearances in some form or another, whether it be in other films in the MCU or in Disney Plus shows. But all of them were just so fantastic entries in the MCU. Such a fun film that really surprised me. Coming in at my number 7 pick, I have Captain America Civil War. Now, this is technically a Captain America film, but I've always kind of considered it a mini Avengers film because of all the characters involved. I was really excited when they were going to adapt this from the comic books. Of course, it wasn't going to be 100% accurate, but I was really excited just because it's a great story, and I knew it was going to divide audiences just because you got to be Team Captain America or Team Iron Man. Personally, I was Team Captain America. But I really liked the dynamic in this film. Of course, the story was really strong, and the character dynamics were really strong. It was just a weird to just see the characters go against each other, but it was also awesome at the same time because it made some really great action moments as well, especially like the final battle. But I think the big one that everybody always knows is the airport scene where it's Team Captain America versus Team Iron Man. Definitely one of the best action scenes in all the MCU up until at that point, especially. Coming in at my number 6 pick, I have Iron Man. Now, before we had the Marvel formula, or this massive shared universe, this was a great building block for what was to come in the MCU. Robert Downey Jr., I mean, him as Tony Stark is just one of the best casting choices ever, probably. He just has so much unlimited charm. You just can't help but to love the guy, no matter what he does or who he's talking to, because he has great chemistry with so many characters. It's really hard to actually find like a fault in his performance. Not only that, but the actual story is nothing super crazy happens really. It's just the standard origin story, but it's probably one of the better origin stories in all the MCU because it's not really trying to do too much because it doesn't have it's not trying to make this giant expanded universe, kind of connect all this stuff to the other MCU tie-ins. It's just trying to be a really good origin story, and I think that's what makes it so unique. And not only that, but what's really cool when looking back at this film that came out back in 2008, a lot of the stuff with the Iron Man suit really holds up still to this day and still looks amazing and awesome, no matter how many years ago it was. So that's just a kudos to how timeless this film really is. Overall, it's a really great film. Had it not been as successful, we would have not had this entire universe. So you gotta give it credit for at least that. Coming in at number 5, I have Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, it's weird in retrospect how one of the more risky, crazy, out there choices for the MCU ended up being one of its best entries. James Gunn did a really good job crafting this really weird, wild, and unique story around this group of characters we've never really known ever really before. Because before this film, I don't think a lot of people knew about Star-Lord and Gamora and Drax and Groot. But somehow you came to love all these characters and all their different character traits and personalities that were all unique in their own different ways. And they have such great chemistry. It really gets you invested in them. I never thought I'd get invested in a talking raccoon or a tree that only says, "I am Groot." But here we are many years later, and I still really love this team of characters. And not just that, but this film also has one of the best soundtracks, not just of comic book films, but movies in general, because I listen to the soundtrack still all the time because of how great the song choices were. So kudos to James Gunn and the team for making such a great team dynamic film in this MCU. Coming in at number 4, I have The Avengers. This film really broke the mold when it comes to these huge shared universe team-up movies, to the point where Hollywood still to this day is trying to recapture that lightning in the bottle magic that this film had. The story isn't overly complicated, but what made this film just so amazing is seeing all these different superheroes you grew to love over the years all in one setting, interacting and having really fun back and forth banter with each other, and just goes to show you that you can actually do that and put it on screen, and actually is really awesome. Not only that, but the epic action scenes, especially the final act of the film, some of those set pieces just still give me goosebumps, especially where the camera's spinning around and the Avengers scores kicked in, still gives me goosebumps to this day, and just reminds me why I love this series so much. Coming in at number 3, I have Captain America: The Winter Soldier. So this was the MCU's attempt at a spy espionage thriller, and I think the Russo brothers really knocked it out of the park, because not only does this film have some of the best action, but it also has one of the coolest stories as well, with a lot of twists and turns, and shocking twists actually, because the stuff with Hydra, I really wasn't expecting. I also just really love the character growth of Captain America and the Winter Soldier. Not only that, but just his dynamic with Bucky Barnes as well, which just kind of pulls on the heartstrings at times, especially in future MCU installments. At my number 2 pick, I have Avengers Infinity War. Now, after so many years of building up all this hype for Thanos and all that, I think this film actually delivered on the hype, if not surpassed it. Seeing all these characters in one movie is a comic book fan's dream, but Thanos, back to him, he was just a phenomenal villain. I think to this point in the MCU, he's the best villain they've ever had, because he's so compelling, and you're not really supposed to root for him, but you kind of understand what he's trying to do. Action in the film, honestly, is probably some of the best action I've seen in any big summer blockbuster. I was just on a thrill ride the entire time. Even when I watch it at home, I still get really excited watching that entire end battle when they're fighting against everybody in Wakanda. Especially when Thor arrives on Wakanda, it's just non-stop, just hype. But yeah, I mean, it ended in a really bizarre way too, because he wins. Thanos wins. We very rarely ever actually see the villain win in these kind of scenarios, but he actually won. He dusted half of everybody. Of course, we'll see Endgame if the lasting repercussions of all that, but at least at the end of Infinity War, it was actually kind of surprising that that's the way it ended. And with my number 1 pick, I have Avengers Endgame. Now, usually it's pretty cliche to put the newest film in the number 1 spot, but I honestly feel like Avengers Endgame truly deserves it. Now, I don't want to go too in-depth because the film just came out and I don't want to spoil anything, but this film, it's the culmination of 11 years of storytelling, wrapping up so many storylines and character arcs, and it delivered on all levels in an extremely satisfying fashion. Easily, this film has one of the strongest stories in the entire MCU, and the last hour of this alone hits you in the heartstrings while also delivering on pretty much everything you'd expect from comic book movie magic. Not just from a comic book standpoint, but just the cinematic level. This film is stellar, top-notch, some of the best stuff I've seen put to screen. And to this point, I don't know if they could actually top this, Avengers Endgame. I really don't see it. Of course, I said that as well with the first Avengers, and of course they did with this in Infinity War. But for now, I really don't know going forward how with the future of the MCU if they can really top something like this. But I'm sure they probably will. But at the moment, I don't know. So yeah, that was my ranking of all 22 MCU films from worst to best. Definitely a very fun ranking to do. But like I said, leave in the comment section down below your ranking for the films. Let's get a discussion going. Let's all interact with each other. I'm just really curious to get a discussion going about all things Marvel. But thanks so much for checking out my ranking. If you enjoyed it, feel free to give it a like. Hit that subscribe button so you keep up to date with our movie reviews, trailer reactions, rankings, unboxings, and more. But until the next time, I'll see you guys later.